"Sir, this is a restricted area." The voice was a blade of polished steel, sharp and unyielding. It sliced through the reverent quiet of the hallowed grounds, a sound as out of place as a shout in a library. Officer Kalen Riggs stood with his feet planted shoulder-width apart, a posture he had practiced in the mirror until it screamed authority. His uniform was a masterpiece of modern policing, a deep navy blue polymer blend that repelled water and wrinkles with equal efficiency, its creases so sharp they looked like they could draw blood. On his hip sat a state-of-the-art sidearm in a level 3 retention holster. Everything about him was new, efficient, and important. His internal monologue hummed with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed he was the sole guardian of order in a world of chaos. Another one, he thought, his eyes scanning the old man before him. They wander in from the city, thinking it's a public park. Don't they read the signs? Don't they feel the gravity of this place? The man he addressed was the very antithesis of Officer Riggs. He was old, his back stooped by the relentless gravity of more than 80 years. He wore a simple, dark gray suit, its fabric worn thin at the elbows and collar, a relic from an era of wool and careful tailoring. It had been a fine suit in its day, but its day had been decades ago. It hung on his frail frame, a testament to a life that had slowly whittled him down. His face was a roadmap of that life, a cartography of deep lines etched by sun and worry, his eyes a pale, watery blue that seemed to hold the quiet of a winter sky. In one hand, he held a gnarled wooden cane. In the other, he cupped a small, dark object that Riggs couldn't quite make out. The contrast was a chasm. Riggs, a cathedral of modern firepower and procedure. The old man, a quiet, forgotten chapel of wood and stone. The old man's movements were as slow and deliberate as a glacier's crawl. He had been making his way toward the cordoned-off section where the honor guard stood like statues, their rifles gleaming under the solemn Virginia sun. This was no ordinary burial. The flags flew at half-mast across the nation. The man being laid to rest was Sergeant Major Thomas Blackwood, a legend in the Special Forces community, a warrior whose exploits were whispered with awe in the barracks and briefing rooms of a new generation. Therefore, the security was tight. The guest list was a who's who of the nation's military and political elite. And this old man, with his threadbare suit and his lost expression, was most certainly not on it. "I'm here for Sergeant Major Blackwood," the old man said. His voice was raspy, thin, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It held no challenge, no argument. It was a simple statement of fact. Riggs felt a surge of condescending pity mixed with irritation. "Of course you are, Grandpa. And I'm here for Abraham Lincoln." "I understand, sir," Riggs said, his tone dripping with a practiced, insincere patience he used for the confused and the irrelevant. "But this is a private ceremony. Invitation only. I'm going to have to ask you to move back beyond the public perimeter." He gestured vaguely with a gloved hand toward a line 100 yards away, where a small crowd of onlookers and tourists had gathered. The old man did not move. He didn't seem to have heard. His pale eyes were fixed on the flag-draped casket in the distance, a look of profound, unshakable sorrow on his face. He seemed to be listening to a sound no one else could hear, an echo from a long-vanished time. Riggs's patience, a shallow reservoir to begin with, began to evaporate under the heat of his own self-importance. A few people in the cordoned area were starting to notice the quiet standoff. A junior senator, a gaggle of decorated colonels. Their glances were brief, but Riggs felt them like spotlights. He needed to resolve this. Quickly. Cleanly. "Sir," he repeated, his voice a little harder now. "This is not a request. You are interfering with a military funeral. It is a federal offense. Now, please, turn around." The old man blinked slowly, his focus returning from that distant place. He looked at Riggs, his eyes holding no fear, no anger. It was a look of simple assessment, which Riggs found even more infuriating. It was as if this fossil was weighing and measuring him. "I need to be there," the old man said, his voice still a quiet rasp. Tom would have wanted it. The casual use of the first name was, to Riggs, the final proof. This was a classic case of senile delusion. Some old veteran who'd read the obituary and concocted a personal connection in his fading mind. It was sad, but it was also a security risk. "Who are you to him?" Riggs challenged, crossing his arms. It was a power stance. It made him feel bigger. I was his sergeant. The words were so quiet Riggs almost missed them. He let out a short, incredulous puff of air that wasn't quite a laugh. His sergeant. The man being buried was a command sergeant major, a rank that took 30 years of grit and brilliance to achieve. He had retired a decade ago. For this old man to have been his sergeant, he would have had to be, well, ancient. And from a different war, a different army. It was preposterous. Right. His sergeant, Riggs said, the sarcasm now naked and sharp. Look, I don't have time for war stories. I need to see your invitation and a valid ID. I don't have one. Then you have to leave. Riggs took a step forward. He was younger, taller, stronger. He was the law. The old man was just an obstacle. The crowd's attention was more focused now. The murmur of conversation had dipped. The quiet tableau at the gate was becoming the main event. The old man's gaze fell to the small, dark object in his own hand. He opened his palm. It was a stone, smooth and gray, worn by water and time. It looked utterly ordinary, something you might skip across a pond. I just need to give him this, he whispered, more to himself than to Riggs. Riggs's eyes narrowed. The object. The unknown variable. His training kicked in. Control the hands. Control the threat. Sir, I need you to surrender that object. No. The word was not loud. It was not defiant. But it was absolute. It was a wall of granite. That was it. The point of no return. The direct refusal of a lawful order. Riggs's professionalism was now a personal insult. This old man was making a fool of him in front of the most powerful people in the country. Sir, this is your final warning, Riggs said, his voice low and menacing. He unsnapped the keeper on his holster. It was a theatrical gesture, meant to intimidate. Hand me the object and leave, or I will place you under arrest. The old man clutched the stone tighter. His knuckles, swollen with arthritis, turned white. For the first time, a flicker of something new crossed his face. Not fear. It was memory. The air suddenly tasted of bitter cold. The pristine green of Arlington faded to a stark, blinding white. The solemn bugle call was replaced by the deafening crack of rifles and the chattering of a machine gun. He could feel the frozen mud of a Korean hillside under his boots, hear the screams of young men, and see the desperate, terrified eyes of a young private named Tommy Blackwood, his leg shattered, his blood a shocking crimson against the snow. The flashback was a lightning strike, gone in an instant. But it left its mark. The old man's back straightened, just a fraction of an inch. The stoop of age lessened, replaced by a ghost of military bearing that had been dormant for half a century. From within the crowd of decorated soldiers, a man watched with growing unease. Sergeant Major Marcus Davis was in his late 40s, his own uniform crisp, his chest a billboard of modern conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. He had been observing the exchange with the trained eye of a senior non-commissioned officer. At first, like Riggs, he'd felt a pang of pity. Another old-timer lost in the past. But then he saw the things the young security guard had missed. He saw the way the old man stood. Even leaning on his cane, his feet were not splayed like a civilian's. They were positioned in a subtle, modified parade rest, a posture so deeply ingrained it had survived the ravages of age. He saw the way the old man's eyes weren't vacant, they were scanning, assessing, watching Riggs's hands, his posture, his weapon. It was the calm, predatory stillness of a man who had faced far worse things than an overzealous guard. And then he saw the change. The infinitesimal straightening of the spine. The hardening of the jawline. Davis had seen that look before. He'd seen it on the faces of men just before they kicked in a door in Fallujah. It was the look of someone shifting from passive existence to active engagement. It was the look of a warrior. A cold knot of dread formed in Davis's stomach. That young fool is about to put his hands on someone he shouldn't, he thought. He thinks he's dealing with a sheep, but he's poking a sleeping lion. Davis knew the history. He knew Sergeant Major Blackwood had been a young private in Korea. He'd fought at Chosin Reservoir. The legendary Chosin Few, most of them were gone now. The few who remained were ghosts, relics of an almost mythical conflict. He looked at the old man again, at the thin, worn suit and the quiet dignity. A name, a call sign from the history books, floated into his mind. A name Blackwood himself had mentioned once, in a rare moment of reflection over whiskey, his voice thick with reverence. Davis's blood ran cold. It couldn't be. But what if it was? He couldn't take that chance. He couldn't stand by and watch a national treasure be humiliated, or worse, arrested, by some kid who mistook history for dementia. Discreetly, Sergeant Major Davis stepped back, pulling his phone from his pocket. His fingers flew across the screen, dialing a number he prayed he would never have to use. It was the direct line to the aide-de-camp of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Wallace, who was leading the ceremony. The phone was answered on the first ring. Captain Miller. Sir, this is Sergeant Major Davis. I'm at the Blackwood funeral. We have a situation at the main gate. Davis spoke quickly, his voice a low, urgent murmur. What kind of situation, Sergeant Major? There's an old man here. Security is about to detain him. Sir. I think I know who he is. I think he's the ghost of Chosin. There was a moment of shocked silence on the other end of the line. The ghost of Chosin. It was a legend, a story told to recruits to inspire them. A platoon sergeant who had held a ridge alone for 6 hours against an entire company, who had carried half a dozen wounded men to safety through a blizzard. A man who had refused the Medal of Honor, saying, I was just doing my job. The heroes are the ones who didn't come back. He had vanished after the war, refusing all interviews, all accolades. His name was Samuel Thorne. Are you sure? Captain Miller's voice was now tight with alarm. I'm not sure of anything, sir. But he said he was Blackwood's sergeant. And the look in his eye, sir, you can't fake that. General Wallace needs to know. Now. The general is about to give the eulogy. Sir, with all due respect, if that man is who I think he is, the general will want to stop everything. If we let that security guard put him in cuffs, it will be a stain on the Army's honor that will never wash out. On the other end of the line, Captain Miller felt a surge of adrenaline. He knew Sergeant Major Davis. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. Hold your position, Sergeant Major. I'm getting the general. Back at the gate, Riggs had made his decision. The time for talk was over. That's it, he said, his voice flat and final. You are under arrest for trespassing and disobeying a lawful order. Put your hands behind your back. He reached out, his hand closing around the old man's thin bicep. The touch was a spark on a fuse. But the explosion was not what Riggs expected. The old man didn't struggle. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, his arm in the guard's grip, and looked at him. And in that look, Riggs saw something that terrified him. He saw a depth of sorrow and disappointment so profound it felt like a physical weight. It was the look of a father seeing his son fail a fundamental test of character. Just as Riggs began to pull the old man's arm back, a sound cut through the air, a sound that overrode everything. It was the high-pitched squeal of tires, followed by the roar of powerful engines. Every head turned. A motorcade of 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans was sweeping toward them at a speed that defied all protocol. They didn't stop at the security checkpoint, they blew right through it, their tires spitting gravel. They screeched to a halt just feet from the confrontation, doors flying open before the vehicles had even settled. From the lead vehicle emerged a man who seemed to command the very air around him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform a constellation of medals and ribbons. On each shoulder glittered the 4 silver stars of a full general. It was General Wallace, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most powerful military officer in the United States. His face was a thundercloud. The entire cemetery fell into a deafening silence. The honor guard froze. The politicians and dignitaries stood as if turned to stone. Officer Riggs felt his blood turn to ice water. His hand was still on the old man's arm. He let go as if he had touched a hot stove, snatching it back and snapping to a pathetic attempt at attention. General Wallace's eyes, chips of blue ice, swept the scene. He took in Riggs, his hand hovering near his weapon. He took in the old man, standing with a quiet, wounded dignity. And then he moved. He walked with a purpose that was terrifying. He walked straight past Officer Riggs, so close their shoulders almost brushed, but he did not grant the young guard a single glance. He ignored him as completely as if he were a piece of furniture, a lamppost, an insignificant speck of dust. The snub was so absolute, so dismissive, it was more brutal than any rebuke. He stopped 1 foot in front of the old man in the worn suit. For a moment, the 4-star general and the forgotten veteran simply looked at each other. In the general's eyes, there was a lifetime of respect, of awe, of gratitude. Then, with a motion so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air, General Wallace brought his heels together with a crack that echoed in the silence. He raised his hand in the crispest, most profound salute Kalen Riggs had ever witnessed. It was not a gesture of protocol. It was an act of pure, unadulterated reverence. Master Sergeant Thorne, the general's voice boomed, clear and strong, carrying across the silent field. Sir. Forgive us. Forgive this disgrace. It is an honor to stand in your presence. The name, Master Sergeant Thorne, and the word, sir, hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. The military personnel, the colonels and generals, the sergeants major, they all knew that name. It was a name from the history books. A name spoken in legends. The ghost of Chosen. A gasp went through the crowd. Sergeant Major Davis felt a wave of dizzying relief wash over him. He had been right. Officer Riggs stood frozen in a state of pure, abject horror. His mind was a frantic scramble of denials, but the reality was standing before him, saluted by the highest-ranking soldier in the nation. The confused old man. The deluded fossil. The trespasser. He was a hero of almost mythical proportions. And Riggs had been about to put him in handcuffs. He felt a wave of nausea so powerful he thought he might be sick right there on the hallowed ground. Samuel Thorne slowly raised his free hand and gave a weak, slightly trembling, but perfectly correct return salute. At ease, General, he said, his voice still a quiet rasp. General Wallace lowered his hand but remained at attention. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finally falling upon Officer Riggs. The look in his eyes was no longer ice, it was molten steel. You, he said, the single word a condemnation. What is your name? Officer Riggs, sir, Kalen stammered, his own name sounding foreign and foolish in his mouth. Officer Riggs, the general repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Today, you have been given a lesson in the difference between a uniform and honor. You looked at this man, and you saw a threadbare suit and a stooped back. You failed to see the giant who was wearing it. You saw age, and you failed to see history. He turned back to Samuel Thorne, his expression softening once more. He gestured toward the small, gray stone still clutched in the old man's hand. Is that what I think it is, Sergeant? Samuel nodded, opening his palm. A promise is a promise, General. General Wallace then turned to face the entire assembly. He was no longer just a general, he was a historian, a storyteller, a keeper of the faith. His voice rose, filled with a passion that made every person present lean forward, hanging on his every word. Most of you are here today to honor Command Sergeant Major Thomas Blackwood, he began. You know him as a hero of Vietnam, a legend in the Green Berets, a man who shaped generations of warriors. But before all that, he was Private Tommy Blackwood, a terrified 19-year-old boy freezing to death on a frozen hillside in North Korea in the winter of 1950. He paused, letting the weight of the history settle. His platoon was overrun. They were ordered to fall back, but Tommy was hit. His leg was shattered. He was left behind in the snow, a boy waiting to die. But one man disobeyed that order to retreat. His platoon sergeant. This man. He pointed a reverent finger at Samuel Thorne. Platoon Sergeant Samuel Thorne went back. Alone. He ran a quarter-mile through a blizzard, under a hail of enemy fire, and he found his young private. He fashioned a crude splint, hoisted that boy onto his back, and carried him for 3 miles through the snow to the aid station. He saved his life. A murmur of awe rippled through the crowd. As he laid him on the stretcher, the general continued, his voice thick with emotion, Private Blackwood was delirious. He thought he was already dead. He grabbed his sergeant's hand and wouldn't let go. So Sergeant Thorne reached down into the frozen mud of the riverbed they had just crossed and picked up 2 small, smooth stones. He pressed one into Tommy's hand and kept the other. He leaned in close and said, "You hold on to this, son. As long as you have this, you know you're alive. I'll keep its brother. We'll bring them home together. That's a promise. The general's eyes were now shining with unshed tears. For 60 years, Thomas Blackwood kept that stone on his desk. Not his silver stars, not his purple hearts, not even his Distinguished Service Cross. That simple stone was his most prized possession. It was not a reminder of war. It was a reminder of a promise. A reminder of the men who saved him. A reminder of the men he spent his entire life trying to be. He turned back to Samuel Thorne. He wanted you to have it back, Sergeant. It's in his casket with him. He wanted his to be buried with him, and he made me promise that if you were ever found, we would make sure you could return yours. The full, heartbreaking weight of the scene crashed down on everyone present. The old man hadn't come to spectate. He had come to complete a 60-year-old promise between two soldiers. He had come to say a final goodbye. General Wallace's gaze returned to Riggs, and the fury was back, cold and absolute. You put your hands on this man, he said, his voice a low growl. You threatened him. You stood on this sacred ground, a place paid for by the blood of men like him, and you treated him like a piece of trash because he wasn't wearing the right clothes. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wear and the nation you are supposed to serve. Riggs flinched as if he had been physically struck. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, but no words came out. His career, his pride, his entire sense of self, had been dismantled in the space of 5 minutes. It was then that Samuel Thorne spoke. General, he said, his voice soft but clear. The young man, he was just doing his duty as he saw it. The world is different now. It's loud. It's fast. Sometimes it's hard to see the quiet things. He looked at Kalen Riggs, and there was no anger in his eyes. Only a deep, profound pity. It was an act of grace so stunning, so unexpected, that it left everyone, including the general, speechless. To be defended by the very men you had so thoroughly humiliated was a lesson in character more powerful than any punishment. Let the boy be, Samuel said. He's learned his lesson today. A lesson Tom would have appreciated. That honor is not in how you are treated, but in how you treat others. General Wallace stared at Master Sergeant Thorne, his awe deepening. Even now, after all he had endured, his first instinct was mercy. As you wish, Sergeant, the general said, his voice filled with deference. He then turned to his aide. Captain Miller. See to it that Officer Riggs is reassigned. I want him in the archives at the National Museum of the United States Army. He will spend the next year of his life reading the citations of every Medal of Honor recipient from the Korean War. Maybe then he will learn to recognize his betters. He turned back to Samuel. Master Sergeant Thorne. Sir. Would you do us the honor of leading the procession? Your seat is at the front. He offered his arm to the old man. Samuel Thorne looked at the 4-star general's arm, then at his own gnarled cane. With a slow nod, he placed his hand on the general's uniformed sleeve. Together, the living legend and the nation's top soldier began to walk toward the ceremony. As they passed, the assembled crowd of senators, congressmen, generals, and dignitaries parted for them like the Red Sea. Every soldier, from the lowest private to the highest-ranking officer, snapped to attention and rendered a salute as they passed. It was a spontaneous, rolling wave of tribute. Weeks turned into months. Kalen Riggs was no longer at Arlington. He spent his days in the quiet, dust-filled basement of the Army Museum, surrounded by the ghosts of heroes. The work was tedious, but it was transformative. He read stories of unbelievable courage, of sacrifice that defied comprehension. He read about men who had charged machine gun nests, who had thrown themselves on grenades, who had endured unspeakable horrors for the men next to them. He learned that the truest uniforms were the scars on a man's soul. His own arrogance, once a polished chrome finish, had been stripped away, leaving behind the raw, humbled metal of regret. One crisp autumn afternoon, he was on his lunch break, walking the museum grounds. He saw a familiar figure sitting on a bench, looking at the memorial wall. It was Samuel Thorne. Kalen's heart hammered in his chest. He could have turned and walked away. He should have. But he found his feet carrying him forward. He stopped a respectful distance away. The old man looked up, his pale blue eyes showing a flicker of recognition. Kalen couldn't find any words. His throat was tight. Instead, he simply stood straight, brought his heels together, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a salute. He no longer wore a uniform that entitled him to that. It was a simple, human gesture. A gesture of apology. Of thanks. Of profound, boundless respect. Samuel Thorne watched him for a long moment. Then, a small, sad smile touched his lips, and he gave a slight nod in return. A nod of forgiveness. A nod that said the lesson had been learned. The debt had been paid. Kalen turned and walked away, a weight he didn't even know he was carrying lifted from his soul. The narrator's voice concluded, a quiet reflection on the events. True greatness rarely announces itself. It does not wear flashy uniforms or demand attention. It is quiet. It is humble. It is found in the worn fabric of an old suit, in the steady gaze of an old man, and in the memory of a promise kept, sealed with a simple stone from a frozen river, half a world and a lifetime away. True honor is not about the respect you command, but the grace you show to those who have yet to learn what respect truly means.